Spectacular presentation for you all today. Like Kitty said, my name is Ryan Gadzo. I work as a research analyst for the Department of Senior Services. So if you do get a survey in the mail or at one of the senior centers, it's from me. And like Kitty said, please fill it out because it helps us keep our programs going. But today we're going to talk about the murder of the White Witch. It happened right here in Buffalo. So picture it, Sicily, 1929. No, just kidding. All right, so our story takes place in Buffalo, New York in 1930. It's roughly about 6 months after the stock market crash. And the Buffalo Museum of Science is being run by Chauncey Hamlin and has recently moved to the location where you can find it today on Humboldt Parkway in Best. So the main characters of our story today are going to be Henry Marchand. He's 54. He's a diorama creator at the Buffalo Museum of Science. His wife, Clothilde Marchand, who's 50. We also have Lila Red Lilac Jimerson, who's 36, a model and a teacher at a Native American school. We have Nancy Bowen, who's 66. She's a healer within the Seneca Nation of Indians, and Charles Chief Sassafras Bowen. He's 68, and he is the quote-unquote resident of the reservation. So we have Henry, Clothilde, Lila, and Nancy. So early life. So Henry Marchand was born in France in 1887. He was trained in sculpting by Auguste Rodin in Paris, and Rodin is famous for the Thinker statue, which is pictured right here to our right. And these are some Paris streets from about that time frame. It was while he was training in sculpting at school where he met his wife Clothilde, who was also an artist. She specialized in portraits and landscapes. But in the early 1900s, Henry and Clothilde emigrated to the United States. After moving to the United States, Henry began working at the New York State Museum as a diorama artist. His work on dioramas at the New York State Museum, specifically regarding the Iroquois tribe, the Cayuga and Seneca tribes, won awards in 1918. Together, they had 4 children, Paul, Georges, Henrietta, and Henry Jr., who was the youngest. But as their family started growing, Clothilde gave up her art career to grow, to raise their family after moving to the United States. So in 1925, Henry was offered a job as the diorama curator at the Buffalo Museum of Science. As I said earlier, after receiving those awards on his work during his time at the New York State Museum, Henry and his work was highly sought after. And the president of the Buffalo Science Museum, Chauncey Hamlin, offered him a job. Chauncey knew that Henry's dioramas and his namesake would help prop up the museum, especially in its recent move to Humboldt Parkway in 1929. The Marchands would purchase a house at 576 Riley Street, where Henry, Clothilde, and their children live. And this is just a little pull from Google Maps to show how close the Buffalo Science Museum was to their home. And another thing of note, the Buffalo Museum of Science wasn't always the Buffalo Museum of Science. It was actually founded in 1861 as the Buffalo Society of Natural Sciences, and their first home was in the 3rd floor of the Jewett Building right downtown here in Buffalo. So, work at the museum. Henry, when he came to the Buffalo Museum of Science, would once again focus on capturing the lives of Native Americans through the use of dioramas. His older sons, George and Paul, would assist their father in creating dioramas at the museum. In order to capture these moments of tribal life, Henry would work with models in order to capture moments, in order to recreate them later. He would roughly sketch them out while things were happening, whether it just be someone just going about their daily life, or if maybe there was a celebration or something going on. Henry would sketch them out to hopefully recreate as we see on the bottom right here. And to do so, Henry would go and stay in a cabin in Gowanda, New York, which, as many of you know, is very close to the Cattaraugus Indian Reservation. So stays at the cabin. That's actually not the cabin he stayed at. It just looked very rustic, so don't blame me for that. But the Marchands would recruit and employ many Native Americans to model for them in order to to depict various aspects of life. During his stays at the cabin, Henry Marchand was working with a Seneca woman named Lila Jimerson. Like I said earlier, Lila was 36 and worked as a model and also worked as a school teacher on the reservation. But during modeling sessions, Henry would sketch pictures of her to use as reference to create dioramas at the museum. And now on to the Bowens. Charles and Nancy Bowen were looked to as healers using traditional medicine or holistic medicine on the reservation. During the spring, summer, and fall, the Bowens would travel to the city of Buffalo and sell various goods while there. Charles, hence the name Chief Sassafras, sold sassafras roots in the spring, and over the summer would sell wildflowers with Nancy. But starting in the summer of 1928, a couple years prior to the setting of our story, Charles believed that there were ghosts in the cabin that they were living in and that they were trying to take over. So, over the winter into the spring of 1929, Charles felt that these spirits and ghosts were getting stronger and were really battling within the cabin. So Charles went out into the woods behind their home with a bag of cherrywood scrapings and other incantations to do battle with these said ghosts and spirits. However, after going out into the woods that day, that was the last time Charles was seen alive. Now, what a lot of people don't tell you is that our friend Charles Chief Sassafras liked to drink, and not just to sip here or there. Charles was what we probably call an alcoholic nowadays. So they found his body dead, most likely from a heart attack in the woods a few days later after him going to do battle with said spirits. And unfortunately, like I said, he succumbed to a heart attack. But the thing we don't know about Nancy is Nancy and Charles were first loves. And Nancy had been with Charles for 50 years. So after losing Charles in such an abrupt way, Nancy was very emotional and lonely and depressed due to the fact that the love of her life is gone and she was now left with more questions and answers about what happened to him. And she really confided in her friend Lila Jimerson about what she was going through, especially surrounding the death of her husband. So a few months after the death of her husband in the spring of 1929, in the fall, Nancy Bowen and Lila Jimerson use a Ouija board to receive messages from the spirit realm or the other side. And Nancy was specifically seeking answers around her husband's untimely death. So the funny thing about Ouija boards is they were first used by spiritualists in Ohio around 1886, and was finally the first Ouija board was patented in 1891 by a man named Elijah Bond out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So during this communication with the other side or seance, Nancy and Lila start asking questions of the Ouija board, and Charles sends a message to the women that they killed me. In getting such a vague answer as they, the women do ask, well, who killed you? And as the board starts to move, it starts to spell out the letters CLOTHILDE. So then they start asking more questions, and it gives the message about 576 Riley. But these answers still left more questions to Nancy, because Nancy didn't know a Clothilde. She didn't know the significance of the numbers 5, 7, or 6. And she didn't really know anyone with the name Riley. So they're left with more questions and answers. And, Lila Jimerson's like, wow, this is very weird. And so is Nancy. So no one knows Clothilde, but Lila does remember that there was a woman of a diorama artist that she worked with whose name was Clothilde. So shortly after the seance with Lila Jimerson to communicate with her husband, Nancy Bowen starts to receive letters from an individual who signed them Mrs. Dooley. Nancy Bowen would go on to receive multiple letters from Mrs. Dooley explaining how Clothilde Marchand was a witch who hexed her husband Charles out of jealousy due to the fact that he was able to heal people using holistic medicines. Um, also, letters that came from this Mrs. Dooley would also go on to state that Clothilde was doing witchcraft, and that's why the spirits and stuff were getting stronger within their cabin. But the witchcraft she did not work well enough on Charles. So she was the one who went out into the woods and murdered him on that day in the spring of 1929. And that, unfortunately, Nancy Bowen was going to be next on her list. Now, prior to the seance with Lila Jimerson, Mrs. Bowen did not know anyone named Mrs. Dooley. So that was in the fall that we had our seance and the Dooley letters arrive. But on March 6, 1930, Henry Marchand's youngest son, Henry Jr., who's 12 years old at the time, arrives home from school to find his mother dead on the first floor landing of their home at 576 Riley Street. The authorities are notified of the discovery of Clothilde after Henry Jr. ran to the museum to tell his father that he found Mom laying on the ground. At first, the death of Clothilde is believed to have been an accident of her falling down the stairs of their home and dying from the injuries she sustained during her fall. And on the right is unfortunately the vacant lot and where 576 Riley used to stand in the city of Buffalo, a few blocks from the museum. So, after the police are called, they start doing an investigation around their death. And upon further review by the medical examiner, they deemed that the injuries sustained by Clothilde were not consistent with a fall down the stairs. The reason they believe this is that there were 4 bloody gouges on Clothilde's skull, as well as the presence of chloroform in her mouth and throat. So unless she was getting into this chloroform as a little sippy sip, I feel that there was maybe some foul play involved. But as the police are continuing their investigation that day, they start asking the neighbors of the neighborhood if they seen anything peculiar that day. And at that point in time, some of the neighbors do state that they've seen a couple of Native American women walking up and down the street and somewhat around the residence, maybe casing the place for a robbery. So after the police are talking to neighbors around the area, they come back and do inform Mr. Marchand that there were some Native American women walking around the street, neighborhood, and property. And at this point, Henry Marchand does inform the police that he worked with a Native American woman named Lila Jimerson that did modeling for him for his dioramas, and she resided on the Cattaraugus Indian Reservation. So after getting that information and ramping up the details there in the city, the police did travel out to the reservation to Lila Jimerson's residence, and they put her in custody. It's also during this time, pardon me, it's during this time, after being obtained, that Lila Jimerson names Nancy Bowen as a person of interest too. So then the police do show up to Nancy's cabin. When they start to talk to her, they take her into custody, and on her person, she has Clothilde's earrings and glasses. So both women were in custody by 10 p.m. that day, and Nancy Bowen having those earrings and glasses on her were pretty incriminating at that point in time. So after being brought into custody over the murder of Clothilde Marchand, there are figures that we have of our trial. So Judge Frank B. Thorne was tasked to rule over the trial. Unfortunately, I could not find a picture of him in our Erie County or Buffalo City courts. Um, District Attorney Gary Moore was tasked with trying the women on the murder charges. Defense Attorney John V. Maloney was the attorney for the defense for both Lila Jimerson and Nancy Bowen. And of the time, famous high-profile attorney Clarence Darrow helped advise Maloney for the defense of both Lila Jimerson and Nancy Bowen. And if any of you are unfamiliar with Clarence Darrow, he was kind of like the Johnny Cochran. He was the bigwig celebrity lawyer at that time. I know that he had gotten a few people off regarding some murders in Ohio. So he was a pretty big name when it came to high-profile crimes in the United States. So the first trial begins a few weeks after the murder on March 6th. But on March 30th, Nancy Bowen does admit that she did kill Clothilde Marchand. However, in admitting that she killed Clothilde Marchand, Nancy Bowen stated that it was Lila Jimerson who helped convince her that Clothilde was this white witch of Buffalo who was responsible for her husband, Chief Sassafras's death. With that being said, now we kind of have this who's more responsible finger pointing going on, and John V. Maloney is working out a defense for both Nancy and Lila. However, it's during the first trial that Lila Jimerson is stricken with a bout of tuberculosis, and a mistrial was levied at that point in time due to the fact that Lila was not medically able to be in court. So while in her hospital bed battling tuberculosis, she pleads guilty to second-degree manslaughter. But a few days later, after admitting to second-degree manslaughter, she starts to feel better, and she recants her guilty plea and wants to face a second trial. The recording will be out after the presentation. So this is Lila in her hospital bed on our right-hand side here, stricken with tuberculosis. So as she gets healthy, we get to go into the start of the second trial. So it's during the second trial that details start to emerge that paint a picture of Henry Marchand and Lila Jimerson's affair. So this is before the days of text messaging and emails. So the letters, there are letters produced by the defense that show a romantic relationship between Henry and Lila. So as the relationship comes to light in court, Henry Marchand goes on to say on the record that he had to seduce Lila Jimerson out of professional necessity, which it's kind of crazy to think that someone would have to seduce and cheat on their wife due to their profession. I guess it was a different day and age back then. But it was also speculated by many that this was not the first affair out of professional necessity that Henry Marchand had had while being married to Clothilde. It also comes out during an interview while Lila's sitting in prison facing trial that their affair started back in 1922 when he was still working at the the New York State Museum of Science. And it started with a long car ride to the country. It's also during this second trial that Lila Jimerson goes on the stand and does say that her and Henry Marchand had discussions about killing his wife. Then while Henry was on the stand, he would go on to vehemently deny these allegations that he had anything to do with his wife's death and that it was solely on Nancy and Lila. And like I said, it's while the second trial is going on, Nancy starts painting this picture about Lila coming to her, stating that this white witch of Buffalo that had something to do with her husband's death. Nancy then goes on to talk about how using a Ouija board, Lila Jimerson manipulated the board to give answers, acting as Charles, that would convince Nancy that it was Clothilde to blame for her husband's death, not the potential of the alcoholism that he was abiding in for most of his life. And like I said earlier, and Nancy Bowen recants this as well, that prior to the Ouija board session with Lila Jimerson, Nancy Bowen knew nothing of Clothilde Marchand or the Marchands in general, outside of maybe knowing that there was a dioramist coming to events and working with people on the reservation. So also during the second trial, details come out that Lila Jimerson and Nancy Bowen traveled together to the city of Buffalo on the date of Clothilde's murder, March 6, 1930. While police were investigating, though, they discover that Lila Jimerson purchased a hammer from a local hardware store in the city of Buffalo for 10 cents on the day of the murder. It also comes to light that Lila Jimerson gave Nancy Bowen the chloroform that was used to subdue Clothilde Marchand, which they found the presence of during the medical examination. So like I said, in 1930, this is before the 24-hour news cycle. This is before email and Google. So the press were the key to keeping everyone up to date on the trial. But this wasn't just big on the American scene. We have to remember that Henry Marchand was French. So during the trial, members of the French press come into town. These reporters recover a diary supposedly written by Lila Jimerson, written in pidgin English, that's later proven to be fraudulent. For those of you who might not know what pidgin English is, it's me Tarzan, you Jane. You don't have all the words that you really need to make a full sentence, but the point still gets across. Now, going back, looking at this, we do know that Lila Jimerson was a teacher at a school on the reservation. So for this diary to be in such bad, broken English, that was how they believed it to be fraudulent, due to the fact that Lila was able to form full sentences and speak English pretty efficiently. Now, it's also during this time that Mr. Marchand is cast as a victim. One paper went on to say the sculptor was never aware of the fierce aboriginal passions he had aroused. And it gets better. The Time magazine we all know and love today painted Lila Jimerson, who was slim and attractive by most accounts, as a sallow, flat-chested, scraggle-haired, and toothless woman. Pretty descriptive. And Charles Curtis, who was the vice president under Herbert Hoover, pictured on the right, who was of Native American descent, had reached out to the U.S. District Attorney for our region, Richard Templeton, to ask Judge Thorne to adjourn the case. Now, this is federal government getting involved in local matters, which Judge Thorne, sticking to his guns, goes on record stating that the Attorney General is not running his courtroom and that the trial will proceed as scheduled. So after presenting all the evidence, after going through the love letters and the he said, she said of everything, we do get verdicts. And the fates of Nancy Bowen and Lila Jimerson come down on different ends of the spectrum. Nancy Bowen, while facing trial, pleads guilty to second-degree manslaughter and is facing up to 10 years in prison. However, Lila Jimerson was acquitted of all of her charges and allowed to walk free. Judge Thorne goes on the record after the acquittal of Lila Jimerson and goes on to say that the jury's verdict in the Nancy Jimerson case, or the Nancy Bowen case, was ridiculous and a miscarriage of justice, and that Nancy Bowen being manipulated was less guilty than Lila Jimerson. Inciting all the manipulations of her emotions, luckily justice is served in one way, and that Judge Thorne releases Nancy Bowen for time served in jail from the time they were arrested on March 6th to the time the trial ends. And Judge Thorne goes on the record and he states, even though he believed Henry Marchand had more to do with his wife's death, legally, Henry Marchand was not responsible for the death of his wife in terms of the physical act of murdering her. Now, this, we have to remember, I believe was prior to the aiding and abetting and accessory charges that we do have today when it comes to crimes, especially around murders. So that is why I believe that Henry Marchand and Lila Jimerson were able to get away scot-free due to the fact that there was no accessory charge at this time. Now, some pictures to the right show Nancy Bowen after this is Maloney. This is after them getting out, after the Erie County Jail, but I love this clipping from a local paper. Which woman trundles back to reservation? Nancy Bowen, who admitted killing Mrs. Marchand, set free in county court. Plans to plant corn. Authorities term acquittal of Lila Jimerson a miscarriage of justice. I just love the fact that they said she plans to plant corn for the rest of her days. So what you want to know is what happened after the trial. So after the trial, Henry Marchand moved away from Buffalo, New York, and settled down in Troy, New York, which is about 10 minutes outside of Albany. Henry Marchand would go on to marry his 18-year-old niece. Now, I should have put step-niece on there. It was his sister's stepdaughter, or adopted daughter, who he would go on to marry. Now, it's during this time that George and Paul did remain in Buffalo and continued to work at the Buffalo Museum of Science. And the next time you're there, if you're able to go into Marchand's Hall of Wildflowers, Nancy Bowen was 66 at the time of the trial. The Marchand's Hall of Wildflowers are all flowers that were dioramas that were created, some by Henry, but most of them were created by his sons, Paul and George. But as we know in society, the rich keep getting richer. So 3 years after the trial ends, Henry Marchand goes on to get a lucrative deal to create dioramas for the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago. And there was a flyer for it right there down on our right. Henry Marchand passed away in 1960. I believe he was buried in Troy, or outside of Troy, where he lived. His wife, Clothilde, is buried in Forest Lawn Cemetery here in Buffalo. But Lila Jimerson would go on to marry a local man and settle down in Perrysburg, New York, which is just right off the reservation. And she would live there until her death in 1972. Nancy Bowen, they do not say when she passed away, but she was believed to be buried in one of the cemeteries on the reservation next to her husband, Charles. And here are just a few pictures of the wildflower dioramas that Paul and George made that you can find on display at the Museum of Science. And do we have any questions, Kitty?
Okay. Let me take a look here in the chat. So I do see a comment here. News clipping says old Nancy Bowen. Do you know how old she actually was?
Yes, she was 66 at the time of the trial.
So funny how they did headlines back then.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question, so, and I might have not heard it in the presentation, but what was this a national headline story at the
Yeah.
time? Okay,
Yes.
so, all right, and that was the Time magazine or?
That I believe was just from one of the papers, that clipping. I was not able to see what the name of the article was for Time magazine, but that was one of the quotes that was clipped from Time, was that sallow, flat-chested, and scraggle-haired and toothless was
Wow.
Time's
Okay.
best writer.
Okay, another question just came into the chat. Did the niece stay married to Marchand?
Yes, the niece did stay married to Marchand. So he passed away about 30 years after our story. So they were together.
Okay, wow. And we have a thanks so much. Very interesting. What caused you to research this?
So I get this question a lot, and I think my biggest reason for researching is when I was younger, and sometimes you stay home sick from school. Unsolved Mysteries was normally on. So I like to watch Unsolved Mysteries. And I was doing a lot of presentations about sports. So I thought that why not look for something that happened here in our backyard that many people don't know about? There's a little bit of intrigue. So that's kind of what sparked my interest. And I got on the old Google box and started looking up different things that have happened around the area. And that's how I got into it. I did see something from Bob Peluso um, about the relationship between his children and Henry Marchand. I do believe there was some tension there, as the boys did stay to work at the museum when Henry moved to Troy. There's really no breakdown of if how sour the relationship went. I do think that the older two children, Paul and George, had a little animosity, and think there was more there than than was let on. But I think I think that Henry Jr. and Henrietta stayed with dad, even though they maybe were kind of younger and weren't super independent. So, but I think the two boys, the older boys, kind of had some animosity, and were kind of left about it. But they also did say that the family really never talked about what happened after the trial happened too. So that was kind of an interesting thing to say. And I do get that question a lot of Mrs. Marchand being, or the Marchands being related to the actress who lived here, and no, they were not. Different Marchands. I did do a dive on that after getting asked last year on this one, but no, they are not related.
Good question, though. Another question here is, are there any descendants of these people around in the area?
I was not able to find any that were still alive. I know I didn't go on. I tried to do Find a Grave, which is kind of a cool website. I know it sounds super morbid, but that is a good question. I have not looked that up when the accessory charge came, so I will look that up and get back to you on that one. What's interesting that you bring up Bowen Road and Elma, is when I was doing this presentation at Akron, there was a descendant of the Jimersons, from the reservation, which was pretty interesting. They really didn't have much background of it, but I do not know if there is a connection between Bowen Road and Elma and the Bowens of our story, but I can look into that as well.
Okay, that seems to be the last one in the chat. Does anyone else have a question they want to put in the chat box over to your right? You can do that. And I know we have some chatter in the background. I am in the office today, and in order to talk to you guys, I have to unmute myself. So I will, now I'm going to go, and I'll unmute anyone who wants to ask a verbal question rather than use the chat box. I'll just open that up for a few minutes. Again, you raise your hand with the, you should see a icon on the computer screen that looks like that. You can just click on there.
Okay, I saw something in the chat about more Bowen research. I can do an update on the Bowen research to just post after this. Kitty and I can just get on. I can do a fun fact Bowen rundown. I do have another presentation about Elmwood's Underground that was on the University Express offerings for this semester. I'm at Lancaster at 11 a.m. on Wednesday. I believe the second, right, is Wednesday. Yeah, on Wednesday. So if you'd like to see another presentation, you can see me there. Also, I plan on trying to do as many scandals as I can find. So if you know about any scandals or things that happened, please just email them into Katie or myself or to Kitty, and I will do my research to see if we can pull it together for a presentation. But I am planning on doing a new one for the spring. But like I said, we also do have the Elmwood Underground that'll be taking place over the next couple weeks, especially Wednesday at Lancaster. You're
I
welcome.
do see a hand raised here for
Yeah.
Anne,
Yep.
and I'll unmute you, Anne.
Thank you. This was
There
very
you go.
interesting. And in fact, I got closed out of the Elmwood presentation that was over at the Amherst Senior Center. Did they record that?
That one was only live this semester.
Okay.
So if you're able to get over to Lancaster, you can just call over to the Lancaster Senior Center. I'm going to be there Wednesday at 11. So I know they have room, and their room is pretty large. So I know it's not as small as the room. I know the room that they used the other day at Amherst, they had another event going on.
Yes.
So you can always see me there. And then if worse comes to worse, if there is a want for that other one to be recorded, we can record that one as well after the semester winds down.
Thank you, because I'm sorry, I will not be able to get to Lancaster.
No problem.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, Bob.
Thank you. I was just a little curious again about the cause of death for the chief. Was that, I know we touched on a couple of things. What exactly was the cause of death?
I believe it was a heart attack in the
That
woods while he was out there.
had nothing to do with Clotilde then, right?
No, I believe it had to do with his drinking. But I believe during his incantations, sometimes when they get in touch with the spiritual realm, you may be taking some illicit hallucinogens.
Yeah.
So I believe that there could have been some holistic medication that maybe went awry, mixed with his alcohol and whatnot. So I do believe that it was a heart attack that he died of, because when his body was found, there was no markings that would indicate foul play.
So our friend Lila just took advantage of all that.
Yes, she was laying in wait. She was able to diagnose the situation and figure out that was the time to strike. Yes, the master manipulator.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Bob.
Okay, we just take another run through here. We did get another question there in the chat, Ryan.
Yeah, the spirits could have been the DTs. You're right, Chris. That could be it.
Okay. I don't see any more questions or hands raised.
Yes, the White Witch is Clothilde. Yes. Never a witch at all.
Thank you all again for attending today's class. Have fun tonight if you're gathering in trick or treating, going out yourself. And join us online or in person at our senior centers. Forget the little survey at the end. It will just pop up. All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you guys. Happy holidays.